Thank you so much for joining us today on our live webinar series for November. Today we are talking about the importance of genetics with Donor Egg Bank USA. We have our lovely reproductive genetics specialist, Melissa Strassberg, joining us. And I am Tanya Torres. I am the client services manager for our Donor Egg Bank team. So welcome again. Before we get started, I'd like to encourage everyone to look at the bottom of their Zoom screen. You'll see a kind of like a chat box. It is the Q&A section, and you are welcome to and encouraged to submit your questions there. There is a button to be able to post anonymously, so be sure to check that should you like to remain anonymous. And we're going to go ahead and answer those questions at the end of our presentation today. All right, so today what we're going to discuss is a very super brief intro to Donor Egg Bank USA. We're going to welcome Melissa, and we're going to hear her talk. And we're then going to follow up with an overview, again, briefly, of our financial plans, our live birth guarantee, and we'll have our live Q&A. So we look forward to your attention and your questions, and we're excited to answer your questions at the end of our presentation today. So who's Donor Egg Bank USA? We are the #1 egg bank, frozen donor egg bank in the US. We've been around since 2012. We've performed more than 13,000 egg warmings, and we've helped almost 10,000 families in building their families, having their babies. We have one of the largest catalogs in the industry. Very recently, again, we've reached over 400 qualified donors, which has been very exciting. And all of these donors have gone through extensive screenings, genetic, psychological, and infectious disease screening. We're proud of all the donors that we have available and believe that they're all the best, going to give our clients the best opportunity for success. We offer a live birth guarantee option. We actually offer 2 live birth guarantee options, which extend our clients peace of mind in that they'll be able to achieve a live birth or receive a full refund for their plan fee. And last but not least, we have a team of family building consultants who are available by phone and by chat, as well as by email, to answer questions, helping get this journey started and orient you on what next steps you can take so that you can connect with your clinic and get eggs to your clinic as soon as possible. Okay, so that is our brief overview. We'll circle back, like I said, to financial plans in a bit, but let's welcome Melissa and her talk on the importance of genetics through the donor egg journey. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people joining in. As Tanya mentioned, please make sure, throw some questions in. I'm going to try to run through the slides, not quickly, but as efficiently as possible so that we have enough time to address those questions. I always find that the most interesting part of these talks. So here at Donor Egg Bank, I serve as a reproductive genetics specialist. Prior to coming to Donor Egg Bank and Cooper Surgical, I've been doing various things in the reproductive health space for over 20 years. 6 of those years is in providing direct support to gamete donors, recipients, and donor-conceived persons. You're going to be seeing that acronym a lot throughout the talk. DCPs just refers to that donor-conceived persons. I'm an active member of many different societies, including ASRM, which is American Society of Reproductive Medicine, who makes a lot of the guidelines and practice resources for donors, and then also with the National Society of Genetic Counseling. So enough about me. Let's talk more about donor egg bank, right? So a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. As we know, genetics is just one part of the puzzle when we're selecting donors. So my goal today is kind of giving you a little bit more insight into all of the different types of donor screening that are being done, hopefully give you some guidance on how to incorporate some of this genetic information into your donor selection process, and then set expectations for how you may hear from us in the future after you've selected a donor, used a donor, if new information were to come to light about that donor or that donor's family history. So we're going to be going through what genetic screening potential egg donors have, how the screening can impact your selection of those donors, when you can reach out to us and our genetics team, either the family building consultants or the genetics team. And then again, when might you hear from us? All right. So the donor screening process, it's quite comprehensive. Every donor completes a comprehensive donor profile, provides as much family history information as they can. Oftentimes we're asking them to go back to their family, ask for more so that we can complete a multi-generational family history. All the donors are going to go through some version of genetic carrier screening or testing. We'll talk about that a little bit more throughout the talk. The donor has an assessment for their medical history, their fertility health. They have to be a non-smoker. They undergo drug screening, infectious disease screening per FDA guidelines, as well as psychological screening and counseling. Anything to add, Tanya? Is that pretty much a good overview? Okay.
That is good.
All right. So what is the goal of all of this screening? Well, we want, number one, obviously to determine suitability, that's not an easy word, for our donor program. And we want to be able to assess for any known risks that could impact the next generation. We usually refer to that as heritable risks for significant medical concerns in donor conceived persons. The way that we get to that information is by eliciting family history and doing some of this initial genetic screening or testing. The donor screening process, it's kind of set by different societies. So like I mentioned, American Society of Reproductive Medicine, American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and the American College of Medical Genetics all kind of have some input on the level of screening, how much is too much, how much is not enough, and guidance as to what makes a donor suitable versus not. And then, of course, our own donor egg bank, we have our own internal guidance as to what we consider suitable for the donor program. So, oh, sorry, I haven't been telling you to move the slides forward, so you're doing a great job. For family history collection, like I mentioned before, we do a comprehensive personal and family medical history. That typically includes collecting information about the donor and then 3 generations. So that typically is going to include your first-degree relatives like siblings, parents, second-degree relatives, aunts, uncles, grandparents, and then first cousins. Once you get further out than that 3 generations, the degree of relation you have with those family members become less and less important. So that's why we tend to kind of stay within those 3 generations. The information is provided by the donor and then reviewed by both donor egg bank and then our genetics team, again, to determine donor suitability. In addition to determining the suitability, it also allows us to collect medical history information that's really helpful when individuals want to provide donor conceived persons with a listing of their family medical history, which we know is becoming more and more important as genetics is being integrated into preventative healthcare. Next slide. Genetic testing. So the genetic testing for donors has gotten a bit complicated over the last few years. And if it's kind of mind-boggling when you're looking through the catalog and looking at all of these lists of terms, it can be quite overwhelming. So I'm going to try to shed a little bit of light on this. The donor screening that is recommended is mirroring the routine preconception screening that anybody gets. So there are specific guidelines that say anybody considering having a child now or in the future may want to talk about doing some preconception screening, like an assessment of your family history and genetic carrier screening. The idea behind it is we are looking for what are called carriers, not individuals that are affected. So I'll tease that out a little bit. So when we say somebody is a carrier, we're typically referring to conditions that are what are called recessive. And an individual that is a carrier of a condition does not have that disease itself. But there can be risk to subsequent generations if the person's partner, whether it's a donor or not, is also a carrier. The testing is not being used to assess an individual's affected status. So what that is referring to is there are genes in our body that are referred to as dominant. And if you had a mistake or an error or a mutation in a dominant gene, you yourself are at risk for that condition. So you are affected, whether or not you're showing signs or symptoms at the time, maybe it's an adult onset thing. That's not the kinds of genetic information that's being assessed, but that information is being assessed when we do the family history. Because if somebody has a dominant disorder in the family, it tends to come to light. It tends to show itself in either previous or subsequent generations. Whereas carriers, that tends to go undetected. All right. So when we're doing carrier screening, we're basically trying to prevent two individuals who carry the same thing from inadvertently connecting and then potentially having children with that disorder. So it's a preventative to look for things that wouldn't come to light otherwise, versus oftentimes people are asking us if we're testing for these other cancer-related genes or dominant genes. So no. The other thing to remember, and this is where it becomes really, really difficult when we're looking at catalogs, is that this screening has changed dramatically over the last few years. So several years ago, the genetics community kind of came together and said, here is a subset of genes that we think everybody should include on their carrier screening. Great. We were able to do that because the technology changed. So you'll see this acronym that's on here. You'll sometimes see it on reports called NGS. We're not going to go into that, but that is called next generation sequencing. And that technology allows us to test for lots of genes in lots of people without needing to know people's ancestry, ethnicity, detection rates don't change. It's a powerful technology, which is wonderful, but it's also led to some discrepancies basically, or mismatches between different laboratories, because yeah, most labs are going to do that minimum amount, but then every other lab is going to add on additional genes based on what genes they may think are important, what things they are really good at doing in the lab. So there's inconsistencies from lab to lab as to what genes are being tested for. Technology now is pretty much the same across the board, but what's actually being tested is not. All right. We used to just refer to things like carrier screening or ethnicity-based carrier screening. That's kind of gone by the wayside, and now everybody is being sort of geared towards doing what's this called expanded carrier screening. We're looking for lots of things, or pan-ethnic. It doesn't matter what your background is, everyone gets the same testing with the same accuracy. All right, next slide.
Melissa, I can say from personal experience, I started here in 2017 and the panels have tripled pretty much,
Crazy.
if not
Crazy.
more, between then and now.
Yeah.
And just the overall technology that we see in IVF and fertility care is incredible, which is good, but it's also like, whoa, like
Yeah, it definitely adds to the
it
complexity, right?
adds to the complexity so much. So
Yes.
awesome.
Yep. Yeah. In an ideal world, everyone would get tested for the same thing, right? Like if you go to to a lab to get a complete blood count, everyone gets the same test, whether it's done by LabCorp or Quest, whatever lab you do it, you get the same test, you get the same information. That's not the same with carrier screening. So some labs say, I'm only going to test for 200. Others labs test for 800, right? At the end of the day, it's not necessary that's one's better or one's worse. It's what's best for what you are looking for. All right. And that's where we can help out in the genetics team when you reach out to us, and we'll go through that a little bit more. So, all right. So back to what a carrier is. First of all, everyone carries stuff. All right. So don't worry about trying to find a donor who's negative for everything. That is going to become harder and harder and harder, because as we test for more conditions, more people are going to screen positive. All right. I tend to share my own. I don't know if that's allowed, but when I did carrier screening, and this was probably about 8 years ago, I was screened for 250 conditions, right? And I carried 6 at that time. And people were like, whoa, that's crazy. Does not matter. As long as the other person doesn't carry the same thing as you, it doesn't matter how many conditions that donor carries or you carry, all right? That has no impact on you, because Recessive genes, you have 2 copies of them, you only need 1. So that second copy is always a backup. So if that backup copy works, great, right? But if that backup copy doesn't work, your body doesn't care. It still has that one normal copy that's doing all the work. You are just carrying the error along with you, all right? Now, obviously, if you're carrying it along with you, you also could then pass it down to the next generation. So that, again, like we mentioned before, is the concern. If you have no personal or family history of this disease, which you shouldn't as a carrier, right? You don't know you carry it. So rather than when I first became a genetic counselor, you would allow individuals to have kids, right? Use donors, and we didn't do a lot of screening. And unfortunately, sometimes those offspring did have a genetic condition, one of these recessive conditions. And then we would realize, oh, people in this family carry this. And then we would screen their family members accordingly. Well, we don't want that to happen anymore. We shouldn't have to wait for something bad to happen in order to prevent something from happening. So the idea now is screen everybody ahead of time, prevent as many of those things as possible, right? And build your confidence in the donor that you're selecting. Okay. All right. I think I addressed everything there. Next slide. Okay. So when you're reviewing these carrier screen results, you'll see on the our donor search tool, you can download their genetic test report. All right. Several things are very important there. So yes, you want to know what the donor is positive for. What did they find that they were a carrier of? But it's also just as important to know what they screened negative for, because remember, everybody carries stuff. So the other source, whether if you're looking for an egg source, right, the sperm source is probably going to carry something as well. So we need to make sure the donor screened negative. So both the positive and the negative are just as important. When you call in to ask questions, you're going to hear us constantly ask, can you send us a copy of the other person's report, right? The sperm source's report, because we need to know what they tested negative for, right? Oftentimes the clinic will provide you, oh, the sperm source is a carrier of cystic fibrosis. Great. What were they screened negative for? So for that, you need a full report. So if you are doing this and your clinic reaches out and says, hey, here's your information, always ask for the complete report. That is always going to be the most informative and build, again, our confidence in making sure everything's been screened for. All right. One of the things that is very commonly misunderstood, right? It doesn't matter, when I talk about mutations or variants in genes, I often refer to them as spelling mistakes, because that's essentially what we're doing. We're spell checking a gene, looking for some variation that would cause it to act differently, right? So that is called a variant or a mutation when there's something that acts differently. It doesn't matter what that variant or mutation is. So some people think we're matching up the variants or the mutations. No, it's just the gene. All right. So if one person carries something in a copy of the gene, the other person carries something different in that same gene, that's a mismatch. All right. The other thing that we kind of have to think about is what's possible, right? If 2 individuals are going in having carrier screening at the same time, well, we know they're both going to get screened for the same thing. But in this scenario, we're not, right? So sometimes it may be that one person was screened for something the other person was not. And can we actually do more testing, right? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. Depends on who needs the additional testing. But you also don't always have to do the additional testing. I think there's this concern or worry that if we don't do additional testing, then we can't use that donor, or that it's going to wind up with something terrible. No, because it depends on the condition. It depends on your level of concern. Some conditions, the chance of someone carrying is going to be like 1 in a million. So is it worth, right, not moving forward with that donor, or having the disappointment of feeling, well, I had a connection with this donor, and now because of this one thing that is so unlikely to happen, I'm going to decide not to use them. Well, that's not always the best case for you, right? So some of this is based on your personal anxieties, what's important to you, the connection to the donor, and not always the exact genes. So the other thing that has come to light more recently is we were always told if someone carries something, I even said this earlier, that you're not expected to have signs or symptoms. All right. There are caveats, as we know, to every rule. So there are some carrier conditions that could maybe predispose someone to have more mild features of that condition, not the full-blown disorder. That information is often in very small print in the reports. So again, Another thing that you may want to review yourself, but also reach out to one of us in the genetics team to talk about these kinds of things. All right. Next slide. How are we on time? We're doing okay. All right. So always, like I said, caveats to every rule, right? So we touched upon this already, that the carrier panels, they're so different, lab to lab, provider to provider. Some laboratories have pre-built panels that don't change. So we know everybody that gets tested at that lab gets the same thing, right? Other labs say, hey, we can customize your panel. Well, that's going to make it more difficult because it depends on what the provider who ordered it put on the panel. So again, it may not always match, even if it's at the same lab. All right. Like we touched upon before, no test frames for everything. This is focused on recessive conditions, and for donor eggs, also on what are called X-linked conditions, conditions where a female would basically be a carrier, but male offspring could be affected. All right. So that is what the carrier screening is focused on. We're not looking at dominant diseases that could cause like adult conditions, things like that. There's always limits to technology. When different points in genetics, we think we've figured it out. We think we have the very best technology. We think we're picking up something. And then some brilliant person somewhere out there says, oh, guess what? I got this new test and it tests more of the gene and we're missing all this stuff. So you'll notice on carrier tests, it's always going to list out something about this residual risk. What that's saying is, based on what we know right now about this gene and how good we are at looking at it, we think this person's negative, right? But there's this teeny tiny possibility left over. That's your residual risk, that that person could still be a carrier. I think of it the same way. We go in for lots of screening. We go in for pap smears and mammograms and all kinds of things, and we just get a negative result. But even with those results, there's a residual risk. There's a chance that it missed something, right? But we don't need to focus a ton on that residual risk because most likely that person is negative. But again, caveats to every rule. All right. Also important to remember, not everything's genetic. Not everything's inherited. Some things are heritable, meaning that there is a genetic component to it, like diabetes. If you have a family history of diabetes, yes, you have a slightly higher chance than the general population, regardless of the rest of the things you do in life. But the risk of you developing diabetes is going to be higher or lower based on your environment. All right. And then, yes, and then many disorders, we just we don't know. We're not as smart as I think people think we are all the time. So there's lots of things that are still unknown that we haven't figured out. Conditions like autism, lots of learning disorders. We don't actually know what's causing them. We know they can cluster in families, but we don't necessarily know genes for them. All right. And something to always remember is any pregnancy has a risk for something. That is one of the scary things about becoming pregnant, about having children, right? Is there's always a little bit of unknown. No matter how perfect a donor, how perfect the other source, how much screening and testing we have, every pregnancy has about a 3 to 4% risk for something. A birth defect, a chromosome problem like Down syndrome, something like intellectual disability. And that is regardless of all of this. All right. Next one. Oh, I'm trying to move forward and my slides aren't moving forward. So, reviewing the family history. All right. Again, negative is not always better than positive. All right. So donors are people. People are supposed to have stuff in their family, right? Everybody has a grandparent with something. So take the family histories obviously with a grain of salt, right? Of course, you would think, right? Oh, I want to see a donor that has no family history of anything, right? Well, it may be that they don't have a close relationship with their family members, that they don't communicate medical information the same way, so they may not be aware of everything even after talking to their family members. It may be a very small family, right? Where like mom and dad are both only children. Well, that's negative because there's not enough people for it to show itself. All right. So make sure to really look at those family histories. Everybody has conditions that worry them, regardless of the actual risk to offspring. If it's something that worries you, that's going to bring you angst, it doesn't matter what the numerical risk is. So it's okay to not pick somebody because of a family history of some medical condition that just really terrifies you. That's totally fine. But also know that you can proceed with someone who does have a family history of something. And you'll notice on the medical profiles, there's usually a section where we call things out like, hey, this is in the family history. I wouldn't actually worry about it. It's probably because of these other things that were going on in that family. Or take note of this. There is a significant family history of diabetes. It's something you may want to be aware of. It may be something for your children you'd want to be more proactive about, teaching healthy eating habits, right? You might want to share things with your pediatrician so you can be proactive. So again, having a family history of something is not a red flag, all right? Sometimes it can be, and if it's a big enough red flag, well, they're not suitable for the program. So you can also be reassured that because of all of this pre-vetting, things that are truly concerning wouldn't make it to the time that you would be able to match. So, and Tanya, correct me if I'm wrong in any of
Um,
that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I've had a lot of conversations with clients about this specifically, like the family history. And I mean, what you're advising, thankfully, is kind of what I've always said to people. And,
Yeah,
it's some of our families, maybe they have a concern because their own family went through something like that. And so they're hoping to avoid that. And so I say what you say, if it's something that's going to create ongoing anxiety, then like perhaps we should explore other donor options.
exactly.
But this part of the profile is so good, and it does sometimes frighten people to see that there's, maybe somebody with high blood pressure or somebody had a heart attack. But I think that's the big picture that we have to think about. Like, that person was 85, and maybe it says they had like some health conditions at some point in time that then led to these things. But a lot of these things are natural, and we all have them in our families. And it I think this conversation is so good because it kind of brings us back a little bit down to reality. And it's so great to have all these screenings and tests. um but we have to align back to like how this is supposed to help us in being able to make a
Exactly.
decision. So
Yeah, exactly. And last thing on this, obviously, family history isn't static, right? People don't stop aging because we took a family history. People will still get diagnosed with things. And so the information that's reflected in the profile is the information that's available at the time the donor has come into the program, but updates can be made in the future. So, all right, next slide. All right, so when might you reach out? Reach out early. I think people are hesitant to reach out because, they're like, no, let me do this first, or, oh, my doctor told me to do this first, but what I find is when I talk to people in the beginning of the process and I kind of give them some tools, give them some pointers, hey, let me look at your results. Let me give you some pointers on things that you may struggle with or things that you shouldn't worry about, right? I always find those individuals have a much happier process. So most of the time I'm talking to individuals who have struggled, right? Who have gone back and forth, been disappointed because they've selected a donor that they really felt comfortable with and then learned, oh gosh, I wasn't screened for this or that, right? So reach out early. If you talk with a family building consultant, obviously they can address tons of questions. If it's something they can't, they escalate it to one of us. And then in the way I usually handle things is I then tend to send a summary email just saying, hey, here's what we talked about. And then you have a direct line back to me so that we also have some continuity, like, oh yeah, this is what you're looking for. Yeah, let's talk about this other donor. All right. So we are more than happy to do that. The only sort of caveat to that is that I am then not your healthcare provider. So yes, I can provide you with factual information, but that information should still all go back to your provider and work with them to see what they're kind of agreeable with, right? What you're comfortable with, all of those sorts of things. So by reaching out early, reaching out throughout, we obviously can address any questions you have about donor screening. We can go over specifics in either your family history or that donor's family history, give you a little bit more context of things. We can go over the carrier screening results. Again, if we have that other person's carrier test report, the full complete one, that's great. We can go over all of those things, and then we can even go through what the different conditions are. You will find when you're looking at these conditions, just remember, you're not supposed to know what any of these are. All right. All of these genetic disorders have really scary, awful names. Some of them I still can't pronounce, and it's okay. These are very rare conditions that you should not be familiar with.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a Google search might
Oh
just
God, don't Google search, please. Like, no.
keep you up at night.
Yes, and especially because remember, these are rare. So the likelihood of them actually having an impact, them actually causing someone to have an affected child is still really low. So things are possible, they're not likely. All right. There are so many other things to worry about in this process. Like focus on those things and not on things that most likely won't happen. All right. Let us tell you about them. But yeah,
Absolutely.
don't cause yourself more anxiety. On this slide, I also just had listed again, sometimes your provider may want more questions addressed. They may want a more formal counseling session. They may want a formal consult note. All right. In those sorts of situations, we need to have you referred to what's called a clinical genetic counselor. So I'm a laboratory-based genetic counselor, and what I can do in this capacity is quite different than what a clinical genetic counselor can do. Most providers are going to have access to a genetic counselor somewhere in their network, somewhere in their region. They've, have a connection. If not, there's also a wonderful tool that's called Find a Genetic Counselor, pretty easy. And that lists all clinical counselors locally. So if you put your zip code in, and then also telehealth providers around the country. So just a little resource. All right, next slide. All right, so you picked your donor, right? That should be it. No, it's not, because then you picked your donor, you still have a whole pregnancy, right? So we have to, so something to remember is, yes, we do all of this stuff in the beginning before a conception, right? But that doesn't take away from the fact that once a conception is there, you still have to do all the same screening and testing for that pregnancy. So we can't say, oh, well, we did genetic testing before, everything's fine. No, there's different types of screening and testing that need to be done once there is a conception there. All right. Um, there's a whole slew of different types of reproductive testing, prenatal testing. I'm not going to go into them all, but you may hear some of these terms like PGTA or PGTM. That's testing on the embryos for specific things. Most of the time, individuals are having screening in pregnancy for common chromosome conditions, things like Down syndrome. There's more comprehensive genetic testing that can be done through CVS or amnio. And then obviously ultrasounds, which are more about visualizing. So screening for birth defects, screening for physical things. All right. Next slide. All right. So when might you hear from us, right? Or once you've had, oh no, this is the opposite. When might you contact us in the future? All right. Well, sometimes we get calls because someone is just curious. Any updates, any changes from this donor? We can let you know that. All right. Anytime a donor reports a medical update, any different changes in their family history, any information from other donor conceived pregnancies, we do document that. All right. We can provide some of that information to you. And obviously, if you yourself, if there's anything that is noted in your own pregnancy or in a donor conceived person, we want to know that information as well, because with those kinds of reports, what we do is we do a deep dive. We kind of make sure, is there anything different we need to do for this donor? Do we need to change anything? Do we need to notify people? And so the genetics team works through all of those reports. Next one. And then that is why you might hear from us. So if we learn new information that can affect a recipient or affect a donor conceived person, we will reach out to you proactively. So if there's something that we feel may impact clinical management that you want to share back with a pediatrician, we will let you know about it. This is why it's really important throughout the years, always try to maintain some sort of accurate contact information, a current email, a current phone number, so that if we need to reach out to you about any updates, we can. All right.
Thank you for that. I make those contacts, so
Yes, yeah, and it's hard. I mean, a lot of people nowadays, we kind of keep the same email for a long time. Most people do that now. Like I have the same phone number that I've had for 20 years, right? So I hopefully that'll get better. But it's just hard, right? We still have a lot of like Yahoo and really old like Alta Vista, right? And we know those don't exist anymore. So
yeah.
just if you can, maybe just shoot us an email. Hey, this is my new contact information. So.
Absolutely.
And then obviously you can always proactively reach out to us. So.
All right. So, Melissa, again, thank you so much for all of
Right.
that valuable information. It's excellent. I'm glad that we have some questions in our Q&A to get to. So for now, we'll just briefly do a little bit of a review of plan options that we offer. So what plan options do we have? We offer here at Donor Egg Bank USA, we offer two refund plan options. Both of these options provide our clients with the protection of the guarantee that you're either going to achieve a live birth or you're going to get 100% of what you paid for your plan. So our assured refund plan is available at select clinics, and you can speak with one of our family building consultants to just verify if your clinic offers this option. But it does provide you with up to 6 treatment cycles. That's equivalent to up to 6 egg lots, and they do come one at a time. And like I said, they provide you with 100% refund if you're not successful. The other nice thing about these plans is that you have the option to leave it or remove yourself from the plan if at some point in that journey you decide that this is not something that you wish to further pursue. And in those cases, you are eligible for a 50% refund back to you. The cost of this plan does vary from clinic to clinic. But again, our team is available and can answer those questions if you wish to learn more about this plan. And there's something else. The refund plan also includes unlimited frozen embryo transfers. So the assured refund plan not only includes the egg lots, but it also covers the cost of the procedure. So thawing, fertilization, embryo transfer. And so it's a really wonderful bundle plan option if that's something that you're looking for. It's excellent, especially if you don't have coverage for your treatment cycles, because it'll offer you the whole package at a discounted price. The multi-egg lot refund plan is similar in the guarantees of a live birth and the refund. In this plan, you have the opportunity for up to 4 egg lots or 4 cycles. And the difference here is that you would be responsible for the cost of the treatment. So if you do have insurance coverage, which is the reason why we developed this plan, you're able to still participate in a live birth guarantee plan while being able to use your personal insurance for the procedures, thawing, fertilization, transfers. So a wonderful option. We have more details. You do have to qualify to participate in these plans. We do a very brief medical review. However, over 90% of people who apply are going to be approved to participate. And generally, if you've been going through fertility treatment at your clinic, you usually have the testing or the screenings that we're looking for in order to determine your eligibility to participate. So I encourage everyone who is even interested to apply to participate. There's no cost. You don't have to move forward if you decide you're going to go a different route. But if it's something you're considering, it's absolutely an option that I encourage to think about. Okay. So we also have 3 other options. We offer our single cycle plan, which is sort of what it sounds like. So it's 1 egg lot and then treatment for 1 cycle. So again, those procedures of thawing the eggs, fertilization, and embryo transfer. The single cycle plan is available at select clinics as well. But we also have our single egg lot and our double egg lot that are available everywhere that we work with. So the single egg lot and the double egg lot are also just what they sound like. It's either going to be 1 egg lot or 2 egg lots. And both are telling you the number of blastocysts that we're guaranteeing with that plan. And again, we have our family building consultants available from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. who can walk you through those options so that you can make the best decision for your family. Last but not least, we do accept progeny. I know that there's a lot of people who are now gaining progeny benefits. So if you are a member, please do let us know so that we can let you know how you can use your benefits through Donor Egg Bank USA. We also accept carrot. It can be used with some of our plans as well as Start Club. So if you are part of any of these partners, please let us know so that we can appropriately update your account. Okay, so here is our contact information. There is a contact us page on our website. If you haven't visited our website, I strongly encourage you to do so. You may register for free. You can actually give yourself full access just by verifying your email. And that'll allow you to view the full donor profile, including the genetic report that gets posted on our website. So if that's something you'd like to browse through, you may do that just by visiting our website and registering on there for free. This is our 800 number, and like I said, from Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. is when we are available. And you can give us a call. You can send us an email. We can chat with you. There's a little chat button in our lower right-hand corner of our website. So we welcome the questions and would love to help everyone on their journey and next steps. Okay. So I did see that we have several Q&A. Somebody asked a question also that I think I'd like to add to, but let's start with with the first. I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at these yet, Melissa, but I'll quickly.
Yeah, let's skip that first one because I'm looking into something super quick.
Great.
The one that was posted at 12:17. Don't worry, I'll get back to you.
So should male partner be tested prior to donor selection? That's a great question.
I know I always debate back and forth. So I am a big advocate for the 5 Ps. Proper planning prevents poor performance. So I always think just having carrier screening earlier in the process is always better. But on the opposite side, the likelihood of the sperm source, the male partner, and the egg source both being carriers of the same thing is still really unlikely. So you can kind of do it either way, but I've always sort of thought, well, when we're doing all the initial fertility related lab work, right? The lab work that went along with them doing, why didn't we just do carrier screening at the same time? So, but obviously I don't work in the clinic. So I would always say yes, but I also know that's not always possible, right? So work with your providers. The one thing I would say is sometimes people say like, well, my provider said I could do the small panel or this big panel. And when you're using a donor, if there's a donor that like you specifically were interested in, you want to make sure that whatever panel the male partner is going to be screened with includes that gene, right? So
Big thank you on that. That was
right. So
great.
yeah. So I mean, if the male partner is getting a really large panel from the client, then yeah, you probably can do that earlier on in the process. But if it's a clinic who really tends to focus, maybe does their testing. I don't want to name different labs because I'm not promoting, or they're all wonderful, but a lab that uses a smaller panel, right? That just kind of, that's what they're advocating for. Well, then that may limit, right, the donors that you're looking at because they may not always be screened. So again, there is no perfect timing. It's a combination of how big of a panel does your clinic usually order, right? And therefore, then would it be advantageous to do it earlier versus making that decision first? So.
And that kind of answers this other question. What is the panel that you guys recommend to be screened for? I just, I like to mention, a lot of people already are going to be screened because that's kind of a part of the process at their clinic. But there's a lot of people who may not already get genetic screening before they're looking at donor eggs. So we're kind of in a, I don't know, kind of like a 50-50 kind of stage. But it's important to be open to the conversation with the genetic counselors and understanding just the bigger picture, especially if you're testing early on and getting a larger panel. And some of our donors, maybe
Have
screen
that yet.
for 176 conditions or 205 or maybe 300. It's just important to connect with a genetic counselor to understand what that means for you, right? So
Yeah, in terms of recommendation, there's medical recommendations that say, that one lab that does 100 and whatever, I can't remember the exact number, 127. Those 127 are basically the recommended testing. So the American College of Medical Genetics a few years back said we should be screening for significant conditions that occur in childhood, not adulthood, that have a carrier frequency above, I think it's like half of 1% or something like that is the statistic, right? So when you look at all the recessive conditions, that's probably about that 100, 150 conditions. But you'll notice some of these panels are testing for 600 and 700 genes, right? So basically everyone is now doing the recommended screening. The extra genes are bells and whistles on top of that recommendation, right? And some of it is just about industry advantage, right? So if you have a lab that's only doing 127, but the lab down the street is charging the same and doing 500 genes, you're going to want the 500 gene, right? That's more bang for the buck. Well, it's not necessarily a better test. Yes, it's more comprehensive, but is it actually getting to, is this going to benefit my offspring? Yes or no? Probably not a significant difference in prevention of disease if we did those panels, the smaller panel versus the bigger panel. It makes us all feel better. The bigger panels, because you're like, oh, well, this thing that has a 1 in 100 million chance of happening isn't going to happen. Well, we already knew there was a 1 in 100 million chance it wasn't going to happen, right? So I think it's more about reassurance and building confidence in actually medical need, if that
yeah,
makes sense. Okay.
yes.
Don't want to belabor the point.
Somebody also asked if in time, let's say years later, a qualifying relative of the donor develops a medical condition that might be a factor for the baby or child, are parents updated?
Correct. Exactly. So
Yes.
if we are talking to, or if a donor contacts us and says, oh, by the way, I had my own children, or, oh, my sister had a child and they were born with this, right? We provide that, right? Make a report of that. We do an investigation. We try to get as much diagnostic information as possible to know, will this impact other generations? If there was genetic testing involved, we try to get access to that to learn, is there anything that we need to do that would provide us with more information so that we can notify these other parents of other donor conceived people, right? So yes, so those happen infrequently, thankfully, right? Because the majority of offspring are quite healthy, and the majority of family histories kind of just have the routine usual things, right? Oh, my grandfather died at 87. That's not something that we're going to reach out to you about, right? That doesn't change anything. But if it's something that poses any sort of increased risk to any offspring, yes, parents will be updated. And you can also reach out to us. So we've had it where it's like, it's been a few years. They go to the pediatrician happens to ask, oh, any family history of anything? And you're like, huh, it's been a few years. I wonder, just reach out to us. We'll tell you if there's been any updates. So
Absolutely. Okay.
this X-linked one.
All right.
Yeah, so X-links are weird. So what is the chance that an X-linked carrier mutation in the donor will be passed on to a male offspring and cause a genetic disorder in the male? Is it always 50%? Nothing is, in genetics, nothing is always, and nothing is never, because that would be too simple. So, so if an egg donor is identified to be a carrier of an X-linked condition, if you kind of like think about it in your brain, that means one X has the change in it, one X is totally normal. Each time that person produces an egg, they're either going to pass on the not working copy or the working copy, right? If that not working copy gets passed to a female, well, that female has another X. So they're going to be a carrier. But if that non-working copy goes to a male, then there is no compensatory X. There's just a Y there. So yes, that child will be affected. Now, affected does not mean significant disease. So that gets into like other nuances. So there are people that have a gene change and may never show symptoms of that disease, but they still have that gene change and potentially are at risk. So that's why there's some caveats. Same thing. There are some situations where females who are carriers of an X-linked condition will also show signs or symptoms. So again, there's lots of different caveats, and that's why it's always good just to reach out to us. If an egg donor is found to be a carrier of an X-linked condition, they are not suitable for the program because of that risk to males. So carrier of a recessive condition, that is a-okay. We just have to check the sperm source. Carrier of an X-linked for a female is not okay.
Let's see. Do you guarantee with ICSI?
I don't know what
I'm
that
not
is, but
sure
guarantee.
if we're talking about our blastocyst guarantee. ICSI is completely acceptable. And so as long as there is a blastocyst of quality that your clinic would freeze, transfer, or biopsy, then that guarantee is met. If there is no blastocyst of that quality available, then your clinic should reach out to us so that we can review your case for a replacement. What kind of insurance plans cover for treatment cycles? There are numerous different insurance plans, I think, that do cover different parts of treatment cycles, whether it's thaws or fertilizations, labs, or transfers. The one progeny insurance is one for sure I know that works with Donor Egg Bank USA and covers the cost of donor eggs. But for treatment cycles, you may want to check with your own insurance or do a little bit of research. I think there's a lot of different insurance, especially more recently, that are expanding care for covering some of the treatment costs and cycles. Let's see.
There's one that just came through on the chat, not in the Q&A, on that X-linked condition. Yes, donors are tested for X-linked conditions. There's just fewer of them. So the vast majority of them are going to be recessive. But then the X-linked conditions are things like Fragile X, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I'm now going to blank on other ones. I think OTC deficiency. So yes, it's not always, some of the reports have them called out separately. Others, it's just within the same giant list. So you'd have to kind of go through. But yes, on the recommended list are several X-linked conditions.
All right. I have someone, it looks like someone has asked several questions about the assured refund plan and the refund policies. I would love if you would send us an email or give us a call. There's a lot of different scenarios for the refund plans, and we can go through. It looks like you have very specific questions about like getting a refund if there's like a pregnancy suddenly or spontaneously right before eggs ship or after they ship. We can totally address those questions, but I think it would be best to help answer those like in a phone call so that we can specifically make sure that you're prepared and are able to move forward with that plan. Um, during IVF process, is it possible to determine which embryos will potentially turn into male or female offspring, especially if male has a higher likelihood of inheriting an X-linked disorder? So there is PGT testing that could determine whether you have male or female embryos, XX or XY embryos. I imagine that would list the inheriting of an X-linked disorder, but I'm not going to answer that one.
Yeah, so again, we wouldn't be using a donor who is a carrier of an X-linked condition, right? So, but if this was, say it was me, right? And I was deciding, I was a carrier of an X-linked disorder and I was thinking of having my own children, right? Then yes, one of the options would be, well, one of the options for any IVF cycle is to do PGTA testing, which will tell you XX or XY. It will not test for a gene variant on its own. So if I wanted just to say, well, I just only want to have daughters, right? And I want to avoid that risk altogether, then yes, you could do that. if I wanted to potentially have sons, right, I would do that plus order additional testing called PGTM for the actual Fragile X or X-linked mutation, and then only use embryos that were found to be negative for that mutation. So again, if using a donor, that wouldn't be on the table, right? Because we wouldn't be using a donor that's a carrier of an X-linked condition. But if it's for your own personal, right, childbearing, then it may be something that's possible. So I think that addresses the question. There was another question on here, just so you know, Tanya, that was very specific about a specific condition, a specific personal history.
Okay.
So I had just responded and said, you know, that's something that we should probably have more of a one-on-one conversation about. It was alluding to, you know, unfortunately, some of these genes, well, actually, probably fortunately, some of these genes having a mutation or a variant in them is very rare, right? And so those genes may not be on the typical panel of genes that people are getting, right? So the problem is if you're aware of something like that and you had testing for a specific reason, right? Because a child was affected, they may have had testing that wasn't available on carrier screening. As the panels are getting larger, more of those genes are being captured. So sometimes if that situation does come up, if you contact us, we can tell you which labs are now testing for it. And there's a way to search for donors who have only been tested by that test or that panel. And then that would narrow down those donors that have been tested for the condition you're looking for. So it's still not perfect. It's still not ideal, but we can still sometimes find things. And then there are, again, caveats to every situation. So sometimes things can be done and sometimes can't. So that's why for really unique situations or personal situations, just reach out directly. We're happy to guide you.
Someone asked if twins could be arranged through this process.
I
I
mean, we
love
ain't
that
got nothing to do with twins.
question.
So, a little bio lesson or right. So yes, twinning is more common in fertility process because we're usually trying, you know, either we're stimulating eggs, right? So we're getting, if we're doing, say, an intrauterine sperm injection where we're allowing someone to ovulate and then we're injecting sperm into them, right? In that situation, you're going to be encouraging more than one egg to drop, right? Because you want more selection, right? Something to fertilize. So yes, you're going to have a higher rate of twins there. And then same thing when you're doing in vitro, because the likelihood of becoming pregnant, even with a perfect, beautiful, wonderful embryo is not that high. Sometimes people will put in more than one embryo, all right? Those are non-identical twins. So those are twins that are made from each of them has their own egg and their own sperm, right? Versus identicals, that is where one egg, one sperm come together and that splits at certain points. We have no control over that, all right?
Yeah.
That's a totally random thing, totally sporadic. There's no way to make it happen or not make it happen.
Yeah. So if your doctor, you know, talk to your doctor if you do have two embryos and you want to transfer two, that's a discussion to have with them and make sure
Exactly.
that it's safe for you. It is possible, but absolutely a conversation for you and your doc. And
All
then
right.
someone asked about blood types, if that's important when selecting a donor. My answer very simply is that it is not a factor that you have to match with the donor's blood type, but it might be something that you would prefer. But I don't know from the genetic standpoint if there's anything.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
It
So
matters who's carrying the pregnancy. It doesn't matter the donors. Yeah, technically, kind of. Yep.
um,
I think that may be all the time that we have, right?
oh yes, we
Yeah,
are.
we're
All
overtime.
right. Well, if you have submitted a question with your name, and we didn't get to it, we'll follow up with an email. If you posted anonymously and would like to send us an email, we'd love to touch base with you and answer any and all of the questions that you might have. But thank you again, Melissa, for your time. It's been a wonderful webinar and Q&A, which is my favorite part. So thank you again so much for joining me today.
No worries. Thanks for leading.
All right. Have a great one, everyone. Take care.